When I was a high school student, my family decided to take a trip across country to New York City. So we loaded up our green station wagon and started driving across country. We made a stop in Nauvoo. And while we were there, we visited the printing shop, which was one of the highlights of that particular trip for me anyway. We met a missionary, a tour guide host, who showed us he told us about the construction of the building, and he showed us one of the bricks that was used to construct the printing office. And he said, this brickmaker was so proud that he put his name on his bricks. Well, that caused my dad to chuckle, and a great big smile spread across his face. And he said, that's my great grandfather. Well, after the trip, I learned a lot more about IsaacHill, the man who made those bricks. I learned what my relationship to him was. My grandmother, Eliza Amy Howard Staker, was the granddaughter of IsaacHill. Her mother was Eliza Homer Hill Howard. And I learned also that IsaacHill was William Howard Jr.'s father-in-law. William Howard Jr. married Eliza Homer Hill, who was a daughter of IsaacHill. Well, many years after my experience in Nauvoo, I went to Idaho with my family to St. Charles, and we were going to look for IsaacHill's grave. We went to the cemetery there, and we saw a porcupine, the first time that I've ever seen a porcupine in the wild in the cemetery. But we continued to walk up the hill until we found the tombstone of IsaacHill and his wife, Mary Jane Miller. We paid our respects and then went on our way. But that experience, well, all of my experiences with IsaacHill have left me with a deep impression of him. And so I've told parts of his story many times. And I'm going to share a recent example of that with you.
The story that I wanted to share with you is about a famous brickmaker. Well, that's a misstatement too. The most famous brickmaker you've probably never heard of, I should say. Okay, it's a man named IsaacHill. IsaacHill, when he was 21, joined the Methodist Church somewhere around the state line between Pennsylvania and Ohio. About 4 years later, he was contacted by missionaries. The missionary was a man named Lorenzo Dow, a relative of Brigham. And he joined the church, got baptized, and moved to Kirtland, where he built a house, and he got to work on the Kirtland Temple. He was a blacksmith by trade, but they assigned him to make bricks. And that's what he did. He made bricks to build the Kirtland Temple. In 1835, the same year the first Doctrine and Covenants came out, he records in his journal on July 16th this. He says, wife very sick. Joseph Smith performs a great miracle on her. Now, family lore says that the prophet came to their home and he held his wife's hand and he said, Sister Nancy, arise from your bed. And she did. Okay? But Isaac's journal says that the next month, in August, she was very sick again. And on September the 1st, she died. Okay? Now, I think he probably had a crisis of faith when that happened. He doesn't mention it in his journal, which is very, very brief. But he was excommunicated from the church a short while later. And then in November, the history of the church records this. And I'm going to read the quotation because I don't want to summarize it. On Sunday, the 8th of November, it says, after preaching, IsaacHill came forward to make some remarks by way of confession. He had previously been excommunicated from the church for lying and for an attempt to seduce a female. John Smith, that's Joseph Smith's uncle, then rose and made some remarks touching the proceedings of the High Council in the case of IsaacHill. He observed the council decided that he should make a public confession of his crime and have it published in the Messenger and Advocate. He proposed that Mr. Hill should now make his confession before the congregation, and then immediately observed that he had forgiven Mr. Hill, which seemed rather to militate against the statement he first made, which doubtless was rather to be attributed to an error of the head than the heart. And I don't know whether Joseph Smith wrote this or one of his scribes, but then it goes on to say, a vote of the church was then called on his case, and he was restored without any further confession, that he should be received into the church by baptism, which was administered accordingly. So IsaacHill was rebaptized into the church. The next year, in 1836, he remarried, and he went to Missouri, where he built the first house in far west Missouri. And he helped dig the foundation for a temple that was never built. Okay, in November of 1838, there was some mob violence that he notes in his journal, and he makes mention that President John Smith, the president of the stake in Adamon, Wyoming, okay, the same one who was Joseph Smith's uncle that spoke in Kirtland, had been forced out of Wyoming, he says, and that he came and he stayed in IsaacHill's home in Far West. Okay, the next year, Isaac had to sell his farm. He sold it for a horse, 40-acre farm. He had to sell it for a horse, and he left with the Saints for Illinois, where he started making brick again. He worked on the temple, mostly I think making bricks. And then he entered into a partnership with a man named William Law, which you may or may not know about. William Law, though, was a counselor in the first presidency of the church, Joseph Smith's council. That was IsaacHill's business partner in the brickmaking business. In about 10 years ago, Elder Jeffrey Holland gave a talk in General Conference, and he held up a copy of the 1841 edition of the Book of Mormon that had belonged to Hiram Smith. Now that book is probably worth a lot of money. I want to show you something which comes from the same time period, but probably isn't worth very much money. But it's one of my most valuable possessions. This is a brick from the early 1840s that was made by IsaacHill. How do I know it was made by IsaacHill? Well, you probably can't see, depending on where you are. But there's an imprint here that says I-Hill, H-I-L-L. He used molds that had his name. And he made over 1.5 million of these bricks, which is why it's not worth very much. Okay? Brother Mel Lavender from our ward probably saw hundreds or maybe even thousands of these bricks when he was doing restoration work in Nauvoo, because a number of the buildings there were made out of bricks made by IsaacHill. It's one of my most valuable possessions. Why? Because IsaacHill is my great-great-grandfather. And my brother Mark happened to get that brick for me on one of his trips back to Nauvoo. Now, IsaacHill went on to relate in his journal, in 1844, he wrote, much difficulty on account of plurality. He's talking about polygamy. His business partner, William Law, counselor in the first presidency, left the church at that time. He was one of the founders of the newspaper called the Nauvoo Expositor. The Nauvoo Expositor wrote this scroll of stuff. The city council decided that it should be shut down. And they went and closed the printing office and destroyed the printing press. And that was the event that led to the arrest of the prophet Joseph Smith, who was incarcerated in Carthage. Okay, I think that event was probably another crisis of faith for IsaacHill. But he didn't leave the church. He didn't follow his business partner out of the church. Instead, he stayed with it, and he came to Utah, and he was called as the bishop of the Salt Lake City 2nd Ward. And he served as bishop of that ward for 12 years. The stake president was John Smith, Joseph Smith's uncle, the same one who talked about him in the meeting in the Kirtland Temple, and who then went and stayed at his home after being driven out by the mobs in Adamonte.
Well, IsaacHill was a pretty faithful bishop. There were 74 families in his ward, and during the hard times in the valley, he personally visited all 74 families to find out their situation. And then he wrote a report to Brigham Young with his poor spelling, but he told about the situation of all the people there. He also had challenges because his ward got assigned a lot of the new Scandinavian saints who'd immigrated, especially from Denmark and Sweden. And he had to deal with the problems of language barriers and assimilation. When he was released as bishop, he moved to Idaho, where he lived during the last few years of his life up near close to one of his daughters. But he lived an eventful life and was a very significant individual, at least as far as my family is concerned.